Taxation, and we have a advocacy and mobilizing arm called Sojo Action. And one of the things that we love to do is to organize and convene events like this, where we can reflect on issues that are at the very center of our faith and apply them to so many of the things that we're seeing in our politics. I feel like in many ways, this particular webinar entitled A Faithful Response to Billionaires is extremely timely and an extremely important topic of conversation. Not always an easy one, though. Just yesterday, Forbes released its annual list of the world's billionaires, which now total, and this even kind of blew my mind, 3,428 billionaires in the world, which is an increase of 400 compared to last year. This year's billionaire class is worth a combined $20.1 trillion, which is $4 trillion more than last year's total income. I was also struck by a recent report by Oxfam. They have an annual report. This year's was called Resisting the Rule of the Rich, Protecting Freedom from Billionaire Power, where they found that the amount of wealth owned by the poorest half of the world combined is less than the amount owned by just the richest 12 billionaires in the world. Many of those are Americans. And so we are living in a time of, in some ways, unprecedented wealth inequality, and many of us would argue extremely egregious wealth inequality. And I want to emphasize that we are not here to demonize wealth or the wealthy, but we are gathered together to try to reflect on what our faith has to say about wealth, particularly excessive wealth, what it has to say about greed and avarice, and really try to better understand and interrogate the political and economic and moral implications of extreme wealth. And I'm extremely grateful that we have a group of panelists that are going to help us dig deeper into this topic, into this question, and I'm going to introduce them in a second. Just also emphasize that for those of us who come at many of these questions and issues from a Christian lens or a Christian faith lens, our faith has a lot to say about wealth and the spirituality of wealth. We certainly know that the biblical prophets spoke to issues of wealth and poverty constantly. We also know that Jesus didn't mince words when he often addressed issues of wealth. He said, "No one can serve two masters. Either you'll hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." And so there are ways in which wealth is a faith issue. It's a spiritual issue. And it has certainly become an increasingly political issue in an age in which we are seeing a kind of incredible degree of how the kind of uber wealthy are influencing and oftentimes corrupting our politics. And so we're going to get into all of that. I want to introduce our three panelists who are going to kind of help us unpack this topic and engage in it. We are going to hear from Abby Disney, who is an award-winning filmmaker, writer, philanthropist, and activist. Her films include The American Dream and Other Fairy Tales, and the Emmy award-winning film, The Armor of Light. She has been a progressive activist who speaks out against corporate greed and the need to tax the top 1% much more. She has testified before the U.S. Committee on Financial Services, the Senate Finance Subcommittee, and the Senate Budget Committee. And her writing has appeared in print and online versions of The New Republic, The Guardian, The Atlantic, CNN Business, and The Washington Post. And we're extremely grateful that she has joined us for this webinar. We're also going to hear from Chuck Collins, who serves as the director of the program on inequality and the common good at the Institute for Policy Studies, where he co-edits inequality.org. Chuck is an expert on U.S. inequality and the racial wealth divide, and author of over 10 books and dozens of reports about inequality, climate disruption, philanthropy, and the racial wealth divide. He was the former executive director of the UFE from 1995 to 2001 and the program director until 2005. And we're also joined by Reverend Dr. Liz Theo-Harris, who is a theologian, an author, a pastor, and an anti-poverty organizer. She is the founder and executive director of the Cairo Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice. She's an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA, co-pastor of the Freedom Church of the Poor, and teaches at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. I've not done justice to all of their incredible accomplishments and resumes, but I did want to give you a sense of who you're going to be hearing from. And so we want to jump right in. I'm going to engage them in some initial conversation, and then we're going to open it up for some questions from those of you that are joining us virtually, or those of you that are part of this webinar. And so to kind of get us started, I would love for each of you to share a little bit about your own journey with wealth and potentially with poverty. How do you define wealth and extreme wealth, and what is your relationship to it? And if I could maybe start with you, Abby, and then go to Chuck and then to Liz. I think you're still muted. There you go.
The old mute rookie thing.
All
Everybody
good.
does it. It doesn't matter how long we've all been on Zoom together. Thank you. Thank you, Adam, and thank you for that lovely introduction. And yes, Jesus was very clear. I was raised in a very observant Catholic family, Irish Catholic specifically, which is a very specific kind of Catholicism. Yeats said something about like he never let an opportunity get in the way of an opportunity to be really, really sad. I'm totally misquoting him, but anyway, that was it. So disaster was always right around the corner, ready to drop from the heavens upon us. And so mixed together in that kind of an upbringing was also the fact that was obvious to me from somewhat young, that we had more than other people had. I'm still not sure exactly how I picked up on that, because when you're really, really little and you're just in a protected environment. But I think it might have been the number of times I stood on podia with people who are cutting ribbons for new rides and looked down upon the regular children who would have, killed to be up there and on the first car or whatever with me. So I guess I always had a sense of it. But definitely I came home from church one Sunday crying because of that whole thing about the eye of a needle. I came home crying one Sunday, and my mother batted it aside and said, it's just a metaphor. Never sat well with me. And I think just there was never a time when I was fine with any of it. And my family made fun of me for being the quote bleeding heart and the rest of it. In fact, we weren't that wealthy when I was growing up. We were obviously, recognizably, by any measure, so much better off than most people. But in the 1990s, what happened to the share price at Disney changed us materially. And I think we went from having more than enough money to having more money than is reasonable for any person to have, if there's a distinction between those things. Money that could never be spent, things that could never be used, houses that people weren't inside of. The airplane, which had propellers when I was 15, now had jet engines and eventually became a 737, and I kind of, the bedroom that they were just showing Christine pictures of at that hearing last week is precisely the same bedroom that I would occasionally sleep in on my way across the Atlantic. So there's a difference between rich and then that kind of rich. And on the way from the regular rich to the stupid rich, the world changed quite a bit. And what I saw happen under my nose here in New York City was rich people changed. They became different about being rich. So whereas when I was younger, there was a sense of, you need to be a little apologetic, maybe humble about it. You needed to kind of see it as even embarrassing a little bit. I think that Chuck would remember this well too, right? There was a sense, especially when you left for college, that you were vulnerable because of what people knew you had. So I watched rich people change and the ideology of being rich change, and at a macro level, and then I watched at a micro level as my family changed and the nature particularly of my parents changed. So yes, I know that there's a difference between being rich and being ridiculously rich, and I'm very sensitive to what happens to the human spirit in that process.
Yeah. Just real quick, one thing I've wanted to mention in the intro, and this is a good segue as I turn to Chuck. One of the things that really inspired this webinar is a article in our January issue of Sojourners. I really want to thank our editor, Julie Poulter, who did an incredible interview with Chuck Collins, and it's the feature article in this issue. So please check out sojo.net and you can read about it. I want to thank our editorial team for all of their work, but particularly for this article and issue. It was based on Chuck's most recent book, The Big Steal, which you could certainly talk about more. But Chuck, I'd like to turn to you to hear a little bit more of your story.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks to the whole Sojourners community for the decades of prophetic writing. And, I've sometimes floated around between religious communities, but Sojourners has been my consistent church in a sense. And the people who come together around that. So I'm just so happy to be with you all. And like Abby, my story of wealth goes back to picking my parents, which most of us don't do, but I don't think I did. But by accident of birth, I was born. My great grandfather was the meat packer Oscar Mayer, also from that Western Ireland thing. So, Abby and I are probably distant cousins or something. But that being born on third base, being born into a kind of well-known brand identity family, was part of my growing up. I also, like Abby, wrestled with the parable of the rich young man, and I still remember he went away sorrowful because he had so many possessions. And I think that very much informed in my 20s living in a Catholic worker community and making the decision to give away the wealth that had accrued and been given to me as an inheritance, and not out of a sense of rejection of my family, but really just I really wanted to try to make my own way, which again, it was sort of a myth. But at the time, I thought, well, I'll give away this wealth and I'll get to be like everybody else. But in fact, I had still exposed this incredible mountain of other advantages than when you grow up in a multi-generational, wealthy or affluent family. So that's somewhat of my story of wealth. And then I've just had, like, as Abigail said, kind of this intimate front row seat to like what's happened with wealth in the last 40, 50 years. I was 7 in 1967 when the Detroit uprising, the so-called riots happened, and that just kind of planted the seed in me, like all is not well, there's something broken here. So, I've come to understand both the acceleration of wealth at the top and seeing that within my own family and social kids I went to high school with. Um, I've seen this industry of the wealth defense, the people who professionally hide the wealth of the super rich and avoid tax. And the real heartbreaking impact of this pulling apart that we're living through. And you had a little bit of a prompt question, when has wealth become extreme wealth? And Abby alluded to this, but I would say, at a certain point, the 40 to $50 million mark, that top 1/10 of 1% is where you know, you go from being comfortable and having agency and incredible wealth and be able to what to you're not just buying another boat or another house, you're buying a senator or a news outlet. You're beginning to exercise power, power over others, power to extract wealth from other corners of the economy. And that's where I see the moment we're living in is kind of a hyper extractive moment where the billionaires are engineering the economy to hoover up even more plunder, if you will, what belongs to the commons and belongs to everyone else. So anyway, that's a little bit of the context that's informed me, and I'm fortunate to have been able to work for the last 30 years really on these issues of inequality and the wealth gap and what we can do about it. And I'm encouraged. I sort of feel like we're in the midst of a great awakening, thanks to the conversations like this.
Thanks, Chuck. I'm going to turn to Reverend Liz. In addition to being an organizer, she's also a public theologian. So there's already some good exchange and questions in the chat. We will get to some of those questions, but I just want to ask you, Reverend Liz, in addition to telling some of your story, if you could kind of reflect on the distinction between wealth and greed, kind of how those interrelate.
Yeah, thanks so much, Adam, and thanks to you and to Sojourners for convening us here. I have, uh, I have I've been a follower and a lover of Sojourners really uh, much of my entire life. So, and I'm very honored to be with this crew of people. And I really appreciate the framing that you just made, because because that's kind of where I want to come in is one of the things I really love about that Bible passage you were referring to at the beginning, like that you can't worship um, uh, kind of God and money, is that I really like the translation that says it's God and mammon. Because I don't think that the Bible is actually super negative about wealth. Um, Nice things are throughout, and the affirmation that people deserve nice things, nice jewelry, nice anointings, where it seems to be that there's trouble is when there's inequality, when there's lack, when there's kind of uh, abandonment amid abundance or poverty amid plenty. Um, and there's a lot of that. And so where I come from on these issues is from a place where I have been doing very grassroots anti-poverty organizing for really my entire adult life and much of my life before then. I was raised in a family that could make ends meet, and yet in my lifetime. I have been unhoused. I have been without health care. I've worked all kinds of low-wage jobs. And maybe more importantly, like where I found my church and my community was amongst poor and unhoused people in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. And so I have spent much of my life in many of the poorest places in these yet to be United States. And and where poverty kills. Poverty is one of the leading causes of death in the richest nation to ever exist. About half of the U.S. population, even before 2025, was already in some level of poverty or one small emergency from it. Um, and I think that this is what the kind of Bible has a critique of. Not that some people have really nice things and have wealth and luxury, but that so many people have very nice things with a whole lot more people having absolutely nothing. I mean, in that report that you referenced from Oxfam, I mean, the fact that like 1,000th of a% of the population of the world controls as much wealth as half of the world's population. There's nothing in the Bible that says that anybody is worth, you know, that much more than anyone else. Like there's no kind of theological justification of that kind of chasm. Um, and especially when greed comes in, like you said. Like, I go back to the kind of, I mean, there's anti-poverty program after anti-poverty program in the Bible, but if we start with like something like manna, because we're approaching the Passover right now, um, and where no one can have too much and no one can have too little, and it basically is a system that rules out greed. Um, we don't know how much some people have. I assume some people have a lot more nice things, but no one has too much and no one has too little. And I think that that's a place where the Bible has a lot to say and our theologies have a lot to say. Um, that that's where we get into trouble is when uh, when not just that people have nice things, but that when poverty shortens and immiserates people,
Yeah.
which it is doing right now.
Yeah. Thank you, Liz. I love how you just kind of boil that down into a single statement that I want to repeat, which is kind of a moral vision of where no one has too much and no one has too little. So I want to kind of ask Chuck and Abby to reflect both on and we've touched on this a little bit, but how can extreme wealth be a spiritual hindrance? Abby, you referenced the, kind of famous Eye of the Needle text, which should be a pretty challenging text for all of us in different ways. And then I'd also love you to reflect, and maybe Chuck, you can lean in here in particular on what are some of the ways in which extreme wealth is so often connected to exploitation, to the kind of manipulating of our political system? You kind of touched on this, but if you could name some of that in this current moment, I'd love to reflect on that together.
Abigail, you want to start there, or you're on mute?
I'm just going to do that over and over again, so be patient with me. Wealth is a public issue, and it's also a private personal issue, right? It happens to a person and a group of people in a family and to a class of people. And so having been born into it, I feel like my lifetime has been a study of, what it happens in a personality where at least financially every question is answered before you can ask it. And if you feel like understanding Liz's life, you get to go be a tourist in it, but you can always come home. So you don't ever know really what it's like to be unhoused. You can look at it, but you can't know that. So there's something really important that happens in the character. I actually saw in the chat, somebody was saying, shouldn't we lift up the bottom 25% rather than attacking the top 1%? I agree with that, except insofar as the people living, I wouldn't say top 1%, I'd say top 0.1% living in the billions. And the hundreds of millions. You don't have to have a billion to have too much money. In people living at a point where there's not a single thing they couldn't buy, including elections, but also, houses and the rest of it. Living at a point where the income off of your corpus is more than a single person can spend in a lifetime, and therefore it automatically grows a little like the blob, no matter what you do. So that is a thing that affects society, but it also affects people's innards, people's personality, and people's moral construction. What I saw happen is our family went from rich to crazy rich. And my father's been gone since 2009. He was a lovely, really good man. But he changed. And I saw that you couldn't, when you tried to connect with him personally, there had developed a kind of like a curtain that would come down. He was so accustomed to people needing things from him, people wanting things from him, that he couldn't quite let himself be known, because to be vulnerable was to be vulnerable to that, being needed or wanted or being asked for things, while at the same time, he was surrounded 100% of the time by people who earned a living off of him, who had zero reason to tell him the truth about anything. And many of them were very good people. Most of them, almost all of them, were very, very good people, but not one of them was really willing to do something that didn't work in their own self-interest, in terms of telling him about what he was doing. And as time went on, I feel that the erosion in his character reached an apotheosis when he, I'm not going to go into the details, conducted himself very badly vis-a-vis our mother, who had Alzheimer's, and it was devastating. It was really devastating to everyone. And from that point forward, he died about 2 years after all this happened. It was clear he couldn't take in the enormity of the emotional consequences for his actions. He wouldn't take it in. I'm telling you all of this to say that there are things that happen inside the heart of a person, that are really powerful things that really take away from the capacity they have for empathy, their ability to really truly communicate and be communicated with. And if you take that and extrapolate to how does that make you behave as a person with power in the world, um, how much would you do to protect your power, to protect your accumulation of more? How much would you do to make sure other people were doing well? How much would you feel people's pain? Then as a class, you do have to ask questions about the 0.1%. I would still have no problem with people sitting on billions of dollars if it weren't for the influence they have on all of our lives, politically speaking, and the decisions that they're forcing all of us to reap the consequences of, whether we have ever been consulted for them or not, because of the position that they have. So I do believe it's incredibly important to really analyze this. If you look, one of the reasons like People magazine was always a really big seller, one of the reasons that soap operas always are fascinating to people is because when you're examining the lives of the wealthy, the stories that come out of those lives are not uncomplicated. There's tons of addiction. There's tons of marital suffering and misery. There's a high rate of suicide. People do not come out of the environment of wealth equipped necessarily very well to manage themselves around terrible challenges. I could see in my family, not just my father, my mother, and other people, that addiction was an incredibly difficult thing to fight. Money was uh, interrupting, power was interrupting their capacity to do what something like AA asks you, which is to humble yourself, to say, I'm not more powerful than this thing. I have a lot to learn from people who don't necessarily look as smart as I am, don't necessarily seem to come from the same place I do. That as just as one example, the money and the power represent an enormous barrier to sobriety for a drunk. So I just think it's really important to delve into these personal things and pay attention to them and understand them as building blocks of a class of people who now currently exercise an inordinate amount of power.
Yeah, I would just build on what Abigail said that I think the system dehumanizes everybody. Obviously, it dehumanizes the most vulnerable people struggling with just basic survival. But we've lived through a 50-year process of the rules of the economy kind of being rewired to funnel more wealth to the top. Not that it was utopia in the 30 years, after World War II, but we had much less inequality. And then when you ask Adam, what's the spiritual impact? I mean, similar to I see what Abby's describing, extreme wealth is for the wealthy is a disconnection drug. It separates people. It separates them from the community of reciprocity and caring for one another, and you pay for services, you don't ask for help. And so you become disconnected and isolated from the spice of life, which the exchanges in the community. And obviously the antidote to that is connection, is and I work with a lot of younger wealthy people who are kind of coming of age, and my you know, advice is go out and just be with other people. Don't seclude yourself among people within this class. And I understand people's anger toward the billionaire class and toward the ultra wealthy and the individual behavior. But I think it is helpful to remember this is a system of rules that and we are all responsible individually for our participation in that. But the system has been funneling wealth in to in and so I think when we talk about, what do we want more thousandaires, fewer billionaires. We want an economy where the rules are building that not too much concentrated wealth and no deprivation. Gandhi's, there's enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed sort of ethos. And now clearly in the US, we've just crossed that line. And I would just say, in terms of like sort of the harms of this or the power, I mean, this is the book I wrote, Burned by Billionaires, is basically sort of saying, here's how it touches every little corner of your life. For the person who said, let's raise the floor, but not focus on the top, I would just say the concentration of wealth and power is disrupting everything. It's robbing you of your vote. It's trashing the environment. It's making you sick and unhealthy. It's supercharging the housing crisis at every level. It's billionaire-backed private equity funds they're not creating jobs, they're eliminating jobs. They're trying to find ways to extract more from the existing commons and the economy, all down the list. So, I think it's really, and for the most vulnerable people in our society and planet, um, an economy organized to perpetuate dynasties of wealth is not a society where anyone wants to live. And it supercharges and worsens problems of poverty and inequality and the racial wealth divide. So yeah, I think it's a key point here. It's not just enough to talk about poverty and raising the floor, because the power dynamics now are preventing us from from having the beloved communities that we want to create.
Thanks, Chuck. And really appreciate, Abigail, you being so vulnerable, sharing a lot of your story. It was really powerful to hear. We're in the middle of tax season, and I, for one, have not finished my taxes. This is probably true for many of you, I would imagine. And one of the, so Tyler Huckabee, who's our managing editor for Sojourners, wrote an article called A Christian Plan to Help Billionaires. And he makes the argument that one of the best ways we can show God's love to billionaires is to tax them further. Sojourners, and I know this is true of the Cairo Center and many others, really worked hard through our advocacy and our organizing efforts to try to defeat and oppose the big beautiful bill. We often refer to it as the big ugly bill that passed even greater tax cuts, disproportionately benefiting the wealthiest Americans. Meanwhile, squeezing funding for food stamps and Medicaid and much more. And so I'd love to ask you, Reverend Liz, kind of how you see the role of taxation in the context of wealth and poverty. And are there any hopeful examples that we can point to where, in particular, people of faith are really not just pushing back, but helping to proclaim a bold alternative?
Well, I first just want to say that I just love and 100% agree with it. The way to love on billionaires is to tax them. Um, and I don't think that I love it just because it's like a way of critiquing billionaires. I think it's a way of of fighting this inequality that is ripping our whole society apart, that is actually making in general our lives shorter, not just poor people's lives, but everybody's lives. That is making our like health worse, not just poor people's health, but everybody's health. That is making us approach this kind of spiritual death that Dr. King talked about, 60 years ago. Um, uh, a spiritual death where our society spends more on incarceration and on ICE and on war than on programs of social uplift, right? And so I think and therein comes taxation. Um, uh, we live in a society, and thank goodness for it, right? I love living amongst people from all walks of life. And part of what makes that society work is having a tax system where we have public services and libraries and postal service and public education um, and the vast majority of people in this country agree that that taxation is actually positive. Um, that that in fact that there's a statistic that like 3/4 of the population would be in favor of raising everyone's taxes if it meant that we were actually gonna like live in a society that functioned better, right? If it meant that our kids' schools were better, if it meant that people had the food that they needed and healthcare that they needed, right? And so and people will often, when we're advocating for living wages or other things, say, well, aren't the rich and aren't the billionaires and aren't their corporations just going to leave? But guess what? We all do better when we all do better. Like it's actually just true. I mean, it's theologically true, right? It's what the Bible says, but it's also just what economics show us. And so this idea of loving on billionaires and loving on the rich by bringing folks into a society where we have a relationship with each other and where the resources that people have raised many times off of the backs of workers and on the backs of the environment and off the backs of all of these other programs and services that exist in society that enable billionaires to make so much money. That has to go back to improve everyone's lives, including the billionaires' families, right? But also lifting from the bottom so everybody can rise. And so there are hopeful examples and stories out there. You know, uh, in Alabama, this year, this has not been necessarily like a good political year, I would say, for many of us that are at least on this Zoom. Um, but in Alabama, some faith folk and other community leaders were able to finally get grocery taxes off. And they're moving towards, trying to get higher taxes to folks that can really afford them, to have a fair taxation system. Yesterday there were hundreds and hundreds of people in Albany, in our state capital. I live in New York City. Um, talking about taxing the rich. And faith folk were in the lead there. Like we're quoting the Bible there. We're making the point that this is how we live out our faith. I, at the same time as I had colleagues in the Capitol Rotunda, was in Oklahoma, where I was hearing about all of these beautiful programs where people are are making sure that folks are not forgotten in small towns and rural areas. And just like making, huge sacrifices to advocate for SNAP benefits continuing and Medicaid not being cut and making plans for when those things come. Like, what are we going to do? But knowing that the church and just civil society can't take up the slack. We have to have a society that provides for the people. And so I think, I've been doing grassroots organizing for more than 30 years of my life. And um, these are dark and dangerous days, and I have never seen the hopeful, visionary work that people are doing right now in my entire life. And so, it's that King quote, "Oh, when it's darkest at night that you can see the stars." I keep on thinking about that. And those stars are in Oklahoma and Albany and Birmingham, Alabama, and everywhere in between.
Thank you, Rem. Was really hopeful and also challenging in terms of the work that needs to be done. But I agree with you. I'm seeing incredible degrees of moral clarity and moral courage, which we need more of course. Before we turn it over to Q&A, I just want to ask both Abigail and Chuck a quick question. My understanding is both of you are involved in a group called Patriotic Millionaires, and I'd just love for you to share a little bit about that, but in a broader sense, kind of how are some of the wealthy in our society, if you will, responding in positive ways?
Chuck, why don't you go first?
Okay, yeah. Well, I actually think there's a little good news in this category, which is the ultra wealthy. That one tenth of 1% is not a monolithic group by any means. There's this network, the Patriotic Millionaires. Tomorrow, they're out. They have a lobby day to press for a new tax bill to tax the wealthy and reduce taxes on other folks. They're speaking out on all these state initiatives. I mean, part of why we're in this pickle is the tax system the ultra wealthy have kind of been opting out of paying taxes. Not high income earners, not the working rich, if you will, who, doctors and lawyers who pay at high rates, but people who are truly wealthy are not paying any income tax and not paying any inheritance or estate tax. That, so to have a group like the Patriotic Millionaires stepping up and saying, here's how this tax system works. If you love us, tax us, to build on Reverend Liz's message there. And the other thing I see is I just see cracks in the wealth management system. I see all the wealth advisors who are saying, I've been spending my whole life helping the rich avoid taxes. I want to work with people who want to pay their fair share of taxes. One wealth advisor I know says, I'll work with you to help heal the harms caused by the extraction of your family wealth. Very different kind of framework. And a lot of younger people, there's a network called Resource Generation. There's a lot of younger people who are very courageously talking about redistribution and kind of influencing older generations and encouraging them to come forward. And, all these states, kind of what, like Reverend Liz said, all these states are going to have initiatives. Uh, we don't have anything moving at the federal level, obviously, in the moment, but people are organizing at the state and local level. California tax an emergency wealth tax, Michigan, Rhode Island, all these states. And so to have allies, have people who will pay those higher taxes say, this is a good thing. People like, I want to live in a community where my neighbors are not living in deprivation. I this, the federal Trump tax cut that passed last year, the big ugly bill, as Adam says, the average one percenter has gotten $50,000 tax breaks. In the state where I live, the average person in the 1% got a $57,000 tax break from the federal government that most of them didn't ask for. So this is the time to say, well, pay it at the state level. Let's make the investments into things that are getting cut right now. So I think there's good news. I think there's a real conversation happening even among the wealthy who want to keep their head in the sand, realize that this is not a path we want to keep going down.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've been involved with the Patriotic Millionaires for, I don't know, over a decade by now, I guess. I think the first thing I did with them involved Paul Ryan and Eric Payne, the brilliant leader, Eric Payne, making an ad of Paul Ryan pushing a grandma over a cliff in a wheelchair. Um, so uh, I think that they're incredibly effective at using not just sort of the common sense that goes into talking about like how much do you really need and what can you do to make this better, um, and a sense of humor and kind of pulling it all together. I just love the way they operate. And another one that I really, really love is if you've ever read Rutger Bregman or know about Rutger Bregman, he's written a bunch of wonderful books, but the latest one is called Moral Ambition. And I just love the framing of that, because I think part of what happened over the last 50 years, certainly the 40 plus years since Ronald Reagan came into power and sort of created sort of a retail version of this ideology that had been animating the far right wing for many, many years, which is we're all in it on our own. We're only responsible for ourselves. There's no such thing as society, as Margaret Thatcher said. What happened was all of the moral ambition went out of all of us, or not all of us, obviously, but so many of us. There's sort of a frowning upon the discussion of things that on a moral wavelength. I certainly know that in the business settings that I've been in my life, I've always been looked upon as kind of an idiot and naive and young and immature and all the other things and phrases and emotional and hysterical, all the rest of it that you use to marginalize a person because the questions they're raising might in fact be hitting too close to home. And so I love the idea of a school for moral ambition, which is sort of what he's trying to establish, where he's creating fellowships for kids who are going into I don't know, tax policy, and they're studying accounting and all these different things. And many of them would go take the highest paying jobs they could take, defending wealth and the rest of it. And he's offering people fellowships to go and use that same great Ivy League education and the rest to study not doing that, and pushing back in the other direction, because part of the problem is we have a shortage of professionals who are willing to think of things differently and with some moral ambition at the center of it all. So there's an awakening occurring right now. I do think, and I think it's global, and I think that we'll all be very lucky if what has been happening continues to happen, which is a thousand flowers blooming, and a lot of brilliance and creativity and goodness starting to surface, instead of this overwhelming narrative that we have been living with now for more than 50 years of selfishness and what we call personal responsibility, which is just, if you had to come out of a woman's body, you're definitely not self-reliant, even for the moment you're born. And there's nothing that we do on our own. So I think there's a lot of brilliant work happening. Really excited about.
Thank you. Really grateful for all that's already been shared. There's an incredible amount of good information being offered in the chat, as well as great questions. And that's a great segue for me to introduce my colleague, the editor-in-chief of Sojourners, Betsy Shirley, who's going to kind of bring some of your questions into the room, if you will. So Betsy.
Great. Thanks, Adam. And this is such a privilege to have your questions. We spend a lot of time as editors thinking about like, oh, what are the questions our readers have? And you just spewed them forth, and I'll try to get to them, as many of them as we can. So as the webinar started, a number of comments in the chat were sort of wrestling with the statement that wealth isn't necessarily bad. Some folks agreed, some folks said that made them want to scream, others noted wealth can easily corrupt or separate us, and others wondered, is it just reflecting what's already inside? And was wondering if maybe, since we have a lot of questions, one of you could volunteer to tackle that.
I think I've been most vocal about the idea that wealth is corrupting, and I'm not, embarrassed to say that flat out. Maybe it sounds like a prejudice. Maybe it sounds like I'm attacking the 1%. I have to say the 1% are pretty sensitive. I mean, that you can't even say boo to them without them going off and pouting about it. It's remarkable, actually. And it's a tell that wealthy people are filled with tells, and tells are those little things that you give away what you really think, like in a poker game or whatever. And one of the tells is this sensitivity. I suggest that you put on your psychology hat and then go read the thesis Mark Andreessen published a couple years ago about why he thinks charity is stupid and why he doesn't want to pay taxes, and what. Go read it as a psychological matter, because that's actually not a thesis, it's a cry for help. I really mean that. I read that and I feel very sad for him, because he clearly, his mommy didn't carry him around enough. He didn't get enough love from his parents. He desperately wants to be loved and seen and heard. And I think that the closer you get to money, the more you will encounter grievous amounts of fear, of anxiety, of insecurity. I know that those are all the things that are supposed to go away when you get money. And that's why so many people are even doubly afraid and insecure, because they expected to feel better and they actually, in fact, feel worse. So that is a kind of feedback loop. So yes, I do think that it's fair, not necessarily to attack the 1%. Money is nothing except for an instrument. That's all it is. It's a morally neutral instrument. But money, if you have a mountain of instruments in front of you, more than you can ever possibly use, that is going to affect the way you understand the world, the fairness of the way things are arranged. I actually would encourage you to go look at the work of a sociologist at Irvine named Paul Piff, P-I-F-F, who has done studies about the effect of wealth on the way people behave. And one of his experiments was with a Monopoly game. And it shows that if you give people like the extra $200, $400 at the beginning of the Monopoly game, then by halfway through the Monopoly game, they genuinely think they did that. They ended up in this game because they're just that much smarter. And not only that, but the people who are losing also come to believe that, and that therefore they're losing because they're not as good. This is exactly how it tends to work, and why a guy like Mark Andreessen really, in fact, believes that he needs to have a larger say in what happens to us. And those are the people who are making decisions about AI right now. They're making decisions about autonomous weapons, which should just send a chill down all of our spines. They're making decisions about who gets targeted in Palestine. This is not, this is this military industrial complex at a nightmare level that Dwight Eisenhower never could possibly have imagined. And so we can't avoid that question about whether wealth is neutral or not, because it's right at the center of our biggest moral challenges as a society.
Great. Thanks, Abigail. We mentioned the cracks that are happening in some of these wealth systems, and this is a group of people who care. What can we do to widen those cracks? Some folks asked about the role of loopholes, but give us some marching orders.
I'll jump in, then maybe check will. So I'm thinking about a favorite text of mine, a quote of mine from Reverend Dr. King, um, who talked about this kind of polarization of wealth and poverty a lot, um, but then found like a real power and agency in organizing, and in fact in people who are poor and low income coming together and kind of pushing and organizing. And so he said that, the poor and dispossessed live in a cruelly unjust society, but if they can be helped to take action together, they will do so with a new and unsettling force that will be they will do so with a freedom and a power that will be a new and unsettling force in our complacent national life. And so I feel like there's really powerful advocacy happening. There are real policies to be pushing. I mean, Chuck was talking about, on a state level, there is work to be done right now, and people are doing that work. And I think to then also back that advocacy up with helping people to take action together, who can then kind of unsettle our complacency to this kind of, again, abandonment amidst abundance. And so, I think there's lots of mutual aid that folk are doing. There's lots of tax reform work that people are doing. There's a lot of election protection work that people are doing. We're right now in a very sacred season. People are out there taking action. I would be remiss to not remind people to show up in full force for No Kings 3. It's right before, for Christians like myself, it's the day before Palm Sunday. I mean, there couldn't be a more appropriate moment for us to march into seats of power and say, not on our watch. This is not who we are. This is not who we need to be. It doesn't have to be this way. And we are coming together and organizing together. So Sojourners puts out amazing content and all kinds of call to actions. If people, there's other organizations as well, but I think it has to be about organizing. That's my plug.
Great. Thank you. And again, just a general, there's so many great questions, and we will capture them and try to answer as many as we can in the follow-up. But I'm just acknowledging I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, so I feel bad, but we'll get there. What folks would love to hear from someone on, we've heard a lot from a particular number of billionaires giving quasi spiritual theological justification. Some folks mentioned the disturbing series of lectures we heard from Peter Thiel's lecture series, if you can call it that, on the Antichrist. Anyone want to kind of offer a response on what's happening there?
I want to hear Reverend Liz
Yep.
on that one.
Chuck, okay, I was gonna say Chuck needs it, but maybe Reverend Liz needs it. Needs
Or
to do
Reverend Abigail, either one.
it. Go, Liz.
Okay, I'll say something really quick because I also was thinking Chuck should answer this. But I mean, the notion that this one of the richest people in the world, who is trying to gain access to everybody's data, um, uh, can then be lecturing folks in Silicon Valley about the Antichrist, and that is about regulation. Um, like it's anathema. Like Jesus would not look well on this. There's nothing sacred or holy or theological or moral of what he's putting out there, and more importantly, um, the kind of preying on people that he and Palantir are doing. And so it feels to me like a bait and switch. It feels to me like, you have, and we have to remember that Peter Thiel is aligned with folks that identify as Christian nationalists. And it's a very insipid and very scary movement, political movement, not a religious movement, political movement that is gaining ascendancy in the country. Um, and what it does is like puts a veil over all kinds of greed and corruption and wrong, um, and tries to decorate it in a theology that just does not hold. So.
Can I just say two very small things? One is if you want to pontificate about the Antichrist, you might spend some time thinking about Christ first. Because like I don't hear any Christ in any of his observations. And the second thing is, if I were the Antichrist, that is certainly how I'd show up. And I would point at Greta Thunberg and I would have everything the same thing to say to him. I don't believe in an Antichrist, but if I were the Antichrist, I would look like Peter Thiel.
All right. I was going to try to sneak in one more.
Oh, Chuck.
I was
Oh,
going to try to sneak in one more question, but I'm getting very polite but increasingly urgent messages from my colleagues running things that we need to wrap up. So I will close Q&A and turn it back to Adam.
Thanks, Betsy. Yeah, there is so much more that we could cover that we would want to delve into, but I am so grateful for Abigail Disney, for Reverend Liz Theo-Harris, and for Chuck Collins for joining us for this conversation. It is meant to kind of whet our appetite for more, and so we will follow up with additional resources and links and all of the rest. But we are so grateful that you've come and joined us in this conversation. This is extremely timely, as we said before. This is a time where our faith is being tested, our democracy is being tested, and extreme wealth, obscene wealth is very much at the center of that as well. So grateful that we can be in this work and struggle together. And God bless all of you as you go on to whatever is next in your day. Thanks so much.